Have you ever felt invisible inside your own home? Have you ever had the feeling that no matter how hard you try, you'll never be enough to be accepted as part of the family? This is the devastating reality of thousands of adopted children and young people who face rejection, emotional abandonment, and psychological abuse within homes that should be synonymous with love and protection. Today I'm going to share with you a real story that exposes the cruelty of family prejudice, the pain of loss, and the brutal transformation that can happen when the one who protected you is no longer present. This is a story about adoption, family rejection, grief, domestic abuse, and the desperate fight for dignity and recognition. Imagine losing the only person who truly loved you unconditionally. Imagine that right after this devastating loss, you discover that you were never really accepted by other family members, that everything was a facade maintained only by the presence of the one who is gone. This is the shocking reality of someone who lost their father and discovered that their stepmother only tolerated their existence out of obligation. How many people are living this same situation silently? How many adopted children face discrimination inside their homes? How many young people are transformed into servants after the death of the parent who protected them? Adoption should represent hope, a fresh start, an opportunity to build a true family based on love and not just blood ties, but the reality for many adopted children is completely different. Studies show that adopted children frequently face rejection, differential treatment, and even psychological violence within families that should welcome them. Prejudice against adoptive children is a social wound that needs to be exposed, discussed, and fought against. Nobody chooses to be adopted, nobody asks to lose their biological family, and definitely nobody deserves to be treated as a second-class citizen inside their own home. When my father passed away, my world completely collapsed. He was my protector, my defender, the only person who saw me as a real son and not as a stranger who invaded the family. But after his departure, the mask fell. My stepmother, who always maintained a facade of tolerance while my father was alive, revealed her true face. The transformation was brutal and immediate. Within days of the funeral, I went from being a family member to being treated as domestic help, as someone who owed gratitude for having a roof over their head. The grief of losing my father was multiplied by the pain of discovering that I never truly had a complete family. That conditional love was the only thing keeping the illusion of belonging alive. Adoption trauma, family loss, emotional abuse, and domestic servitude are topics that desperately need visibility. Too many adopted children suffer in silence, believing they should be grateful for being taken in, even when treated with cruelty and disrespect. This toxic narrative of eternal gratitude perpetuates cycles of abuse and prevents victims from seeking help or speaking out against injustice. Society needs to understand that adoption creates real families, with real rights and real responsibilities on both sides. An adopted child is not a favor, not a charity case, not a servant. An adopted child is a son or daughter who deserves the same love, respect, and dignity as any biological child. My story is not unique, but it needs to be told, because somewhere right now, another adopted child is suffering similar treatment. Another young person is being exploited and dehumanized by people who should protect them, and maybe, just maybe, by sharing these experiences, we can create awareness, generate conversations, and help someone find the courage to seek help and change their situation. Before we continue with this story, I need your help to spread this message. If this content is resonating with you, if you know someone who has gone through something similar, or if you believe these topics need more visibility, please leave your like on this video right now. Understanding content like this is crucial because it helps break the silence around family abuse and adoption discrimination. Your like tells the algorithm that this story matters, that these issues deserve attention, and that more people need to hear about this reality. And if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, hit that subscribe button, because here we discuss real stories, difficult topics, and situations that society often prefers to ignore. Your subscription helps this content reach people who really need to hear it. Also, I want to know about your experience. Have you or someone you know faced similar situations? How do you think society should protect adopted children from abuse? Leave your comment below because your story and opinion matter. Each comment helps this video reach more people and creates a community of support for those who are suffering in silence. Now let's continue from where we stopped, because there's much more to this story that needs to be told. Understanding my adoption story is essential to comprehend how devastating my father's death became and why my stepmother's transformation was so brutal. I was adopted when I was 7 years old, after spending 3 years in the foster care system. My biological parents had lost custody due to substance abuse issues, and despite multiple attempts at rehabilitation and family reunification, the situation never improved to the point where I could safely return home. Those years in foster care were marked by uncertainty, multiple temporary placements, and the constant fear of never finding a permanent family. When my father decided to adopt me, it felt like a miracle, like finally someone wanted me not temporarily but forever. He was a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier and had no biological children. He told me he believed we could heal together, that we both needed family, and that he saw something special in me during our first meeting at the adoption agency. Those words gave me hope I had never experienced before. For the first time in my life, someone chose me deliberately and said they wanted to be my family. The adoption process took almost a year, with home visits, psychological evaluations, adaptation periods, and extensive legal procedures. But throughout it all, my father remained committed and patient. He attended every meeting, completed every requirement, and constantly reassured me that he wasn't going anywhere, that this was permanent, that I was finally going home for good. When the adoption was finalized, he threw a small celebration and gave me a gift that I still treasure to this day, an engraved watch with the inscription, "Forever family, forever loved." That moment represented everything I had dreamed of during those lonely nights in foster care. But what I didn't fully understand at the time was that my father had remarried just 6 months before my adoption was finalized. He had met my stepmother through mutual friends, and their relationship developed quickly. She already had 2 biological children from a previous marriage, both older than me, who visited on weekends and holidays. My father assured me that she was supportive of the adoption, that she understood his desire to have a child, and that we would all become one big, blended family. Looking back now, I realized there were warning signs I was too young and too desperate for family to recognize. My stepmother's affection always seemed performative, displayed mostly when my father was present. Her smiles never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. Her children treated me with polite distance, never hostile enough to raise concerns, but never warm enough to feel like real siblings. Family photos always felt staged, with everyone positioned correctly but lacking genuine connection. During family dinners, conversations would flow naturally between my stepmother, her children, and my father, but often I felt like an observer rather than a participant. When I tried to contribute, responses were polite but brief, never encouraging further engagement. My stepmother would frequently make comments about adopted children in general, carefully worded observations about loyalty, gratitude, and behavioral issues that adopted kids supposedly displayed more frequently. At the time, I internalized these messages, believing I needed to be extra good, extra grateful, extra perfect to deserve my place in this family. My father, to his credit, never tolerated any obvious mistreatment and always made efforts to include me and make me feel valued. He attended my school events, helped with homework, taught me things, and spent one-on-one time with me regularly. He created traditions just for us, like Saturday morning breakfast at our favorite diner, and evening walks where we would talk about everything. Those moments with my father were genuine, filled with real love and connection. He never made me feel like an outsider or a burden. He defended me when his wife made subtle, critical comments and always reinforced that I was his son, period, no qualifications or conditions. But I also noticed he worked hard to keep peace in the household, sometimes smoothing over tensions rather than addressing them directly. He wanted his marriage to work and wanted to believe that his wife would eventually embrace me fully as her own. That hope, that belief in eventual family unity, may have prevented him from seeing or acknowledging the depth of his wife's resistance to truly accepting me. What strikes me most now is how carefully my stepmother maintained her facade. She was never openly cruel or obviously rejecting while my father was alive. She fulfilled basic obligations, ensured I had meals and clean clothes, and maintained household routines. But there was always an emotional distance, a coldness beneath the surface that made it clear I was tolerated rather than loved. Now looking back, I understand that she likely resented my adoption from the beginning, viewing it as something imposed on her rather than something she chose. Perhaps she agreed to it to keep my father happy, but never intended to treat me as her own child. Whatever her reasons, Her true feelings remained hidden behind a mask of basic civility, a mask that would completely drop the moment my father was no longer there to maintain the illusion. Think about your own family dynamics for a moment. How would you feel if you discovered that someone's kindness toward you was entirely dependent on another person's presence? How would it change your sense of belonging and security? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because understanding these complex family dynamics helps us recognize warning signs and protect vulnerable children. The 3 years I lived with my father before his death were probably the happiest of my entire childhood, despite the underlying tensions with my stepmother. My father created a sense of stability and security I had never known before. We developed routines that made me feel genuinely part of something permanent. Every morning, he would wake me up with the same phrase, "Good morning, son, time to face another adventure." And every night he would check on me before bed, regardless of how tired he was from work. These consistent small gestures communicated safety and belonging in ways that grand gestures never could. He worked as an engineer for a construction company, often putting in long hours, but he always prioritized time with me. He attended every parent-teacher conference, never missed a school performance or sports game, and made sure we had dedicated father-son time regularly. During those Saturday morning breakfasts at our favorite diner, we would discuss everything from school challenges to philosophical questions about life, dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. Those conversations taught me how to think critically, how to express myself, and most importantly, that my thoughts and feelings mattered to someone. He encouraged my interests, whether they aligned with his own or not. When I expressed interest in art, something he knew nothing about, he enrolled me in classes and spent hours watching me draw with genuine fascination. When I struggled with math, his field of expertise, he patiently tutored me without frustration or disappointment. He celebrated my successes enthusiastically and helped me learn from failures without shame or judgment. This unconditional support was revolutionary for a child who had spent years believing that love had to be earned through perfect behavior and constant gratitude. My father also made efforts to integrate me into the broader family dynamic, despite my stepmother's subtle resistance. He organized family outings, game nights, and holiday celebrations designed to bring everyone together. He genuinely believed that time and shared experiences would eventually create authentic bonds between all family members. During these gatherings, he worked overtime to ensure I felt included, often positioning himself as a bridge between me and the others. He would direct conversation toward topics I could contribute to, highlight my achievements to the family, and create opportunities for positive interactions. Looking back, I recognize how exhausting this must have been for him, constantly mediating and managing family dynamics to protect me from feeling excluded. But despite his best efforts, the division remained. My stepmother maintained her emotional distance, performing the role of stepmother adequately when my father was watching but never extending genuine warmth or maternal affection. Her biological children followed her lead, treating me politely, but never as a real brother. Family photos from that period tell the story clearly. In every picture, my father and I are close, often with his arm around my shoulder or hand on my head, both of us smiling genuinely. But there's always physical and emotional distance between me and the rest of the family. They're present, positioned correctly for the photo, but the body language reveals the truth. No casual touches, no natural closeness, no authentic connection. My stepmother's children had their own activities, friends and lives that didn't include me. When they visited on weekends, they would retreat to their rooms or go out with friends, rarely engaging with me beyond basic politeness. My stepmother never encouraged or facilitated sibling bonding, never suggested they include me in activities, never created situations where we might develop genuine relationships. Instead, she maintained a clear distinction between her children and me, subtle but unmistakable. Her kids had privileges and freedoms I didn't, expectations and standards applied differently, and a level of maternal affection I never received. My father noticed these disparities and occasionally addressed them, but his interventions were usually framed as requests for fairness rather than demands, probably to avoid creating more conflict in the marriage. The household operated on an unspoken two-tier system. My stepmother's children were family members with full rights and privileges. I was the adopted child, present by my father's choice, tolerated but not embraced. Chores were distributed unevenly, with me gradually taking on more responsibilities than seemed age-appropriate. When I questioned this, My stepmother would frame it as teaching responsibility and work ethic, things adopted children supposedly needed extra help learning. My father would sometimes intervene and redistribute tasks more fairly, but the pattern would gradually shift back to the inequitable distribution whenever his attention was elsewhere. Mealtimes revealed the dynamics clearly. My stepmother would cook my father's favorite foods, ask her children about their preferences, but rarely consider or ask about mine. Conversations would center on her children's activities, achievements, and interests, while mine received polite but minimal attention unless my father deliberately steered the discussion toward me. Family resources were allocated similarly. Her children received new clothes, electronics, and experiences generously, while I received adequate but noticeably less. My father tried to compensate by using his own money to ensure I had what I needed, but this created another layer of tension with my stepmother, who viewed it as favoritism. Despite these challenges, I tried hard to win her approval and affection. I worked to be helpful, polite, and undemanding. I achieved good grades, hoping academic success would earn recognition. I stayed out of trouble and tried to make myself as little burden as possible. But nothing changed her fundamental attitude toward me. Her coolness remained consistent no matter what I did, teaching me the painful lesson that some people will never accept you regardless of your efforts. My father's health had always seemed solid, so none of us anticipated what was coming. He had no chronic conditions, maintained an active lifestyle, and seemed younger than his actual age. But life has a way of destroying security without warning, and that's exactly what happened to us. How do you maintain hope and resilience when working so hard for acceptance that never comes? Have you experienced trying to earn love from someone determined not to give it? Share your experience in the comments because your story might help someone else feel less alone. The day that destroyed my world started like any ordinary day, which somehow makes it more cruel. My father woke me up with his usual greeting, we had breakfast together, and he left for work with our standard goodbye. He promised to help me with a school project that evening, and reminded me he loved me. Words he said daily, but which I never imagined would be the last time I'd hear them. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was at school when the principal called me to the office. My stepmother was there, her face pale and expression unreadable. She told me there had been an accident at my father's construction site, a structural collapse, unexpected and catastrophic. He had been rushed to the hospital, but the injuries were severe. The next hours remain a blur of sterile hospital corridors, hushed, urgent voices, and the antiseptic smell that I still associate with loss and helplessness. My stepmother made phone calls to family members while I sat in the waiting room, numb and terrified, praying to any deity that might listen to spare my father. But prayers went unanswered. The doctor emerged with that expression healthcare professionals wear when delivering devastating news. My father had suffered massive internal injuries, and despite their best efforts, he didn't survive. The words didn't seem real. How could someone so alive, so present, so essential to my existence simply cease to exist? The funeral arrangements happened quickly, organized primarily by my stepmother and her extended family. I moved through those days in a fog of grief and shock, barely processing what was happening. Family and friends offered condolences, many commenting on how tragic it was that I lost my adoptive father so soon after finding a family. Those well-meaning words carried an unintentional message that my father was somehow less important because he wasn't biologically mine, that my grief should somehow be lesser. But blood didn't define our relationship. He was my father in every way that mattered, and losing him felt like losing everything. During the funeral, I gave a brief eulogy that I barely remember delivering. I talked about his kindness, his patience, how he chose me when nobody else wanted me, how he made me believe in family and love and belonging. My voice broke multiple times, and tears made it difficult to see the paper where I had written my thoughts. My stepmother sat in the front row with her children, their expressions appropriately somber but somehow distant, as if they were attending an obligation rather than mourning someone they loved. After the service, people gathered at our house for the reception. Extended family members I barely knew filled the rooms, sharing memories of my father that I wasn't part of, stories from before I existed in his life. I felt invisible despite being surrounded by people, my grief somehow both overwhelming and unacknowledged. My stepmother accepted condolences gracefully, playing the grieving widow role perfectly while her children stayed close to her side. I stood apart, uncertain where I fit in this tableau of mourning, realizing that without my father, I had no clear place in this family structure. The first explicit sign of what was coming occurred that very evening after everyone had left. The house felt emptier than I'd ever experienced, filled with the absence of the one person who made it home. My stepmother called me to the kitchen where she sat at the table, her children flanking her sides. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, cold calculation without any pretense of warmth or compassion. She told me that things would be different now, that my father's death changed everything, and that I needed to understand my position in this household moving forward. She explained that she had never wanted to adopt me, that it was entirely my father's decision, and that she had only tolerated my presence to keep him happy. Now that he was gone, she saw no reason to continue the charade. However, she acknowledged that legally she was now my guardian since the adoption was finalized, and reversing it would be complicated and expensive. Therefore, I would remain in the house but under new terms. I would earn my place through work, contributing significantly more to household maintenance than before. I would be respectful, grateful, and undemanding. I would understand that her biological children came first in all matters, and that resources would be allocated accordingly. If I caused any problems or made her life difficult, she would explore options for removing me from the household, possibly through boarding schools or other residential situations. The cruelty of having this conversation literally hours after burying my father was staggering. My grief was barely beginning to process, and she was already dismantling any illusion of family or belonging. Her children said nothing, neither supporting nor protesting her declarations, simply accepting this new reality as if it was reasonable and expected. I stood there speechless, tears streaming down my face, unable to comprehend how someone could be so heartless to a grieving child. But I was powerless. At 14 years old, I had no resources, no family to turn to, nowhere else to go. I was completely dependent on this woman who had just explicitly stated she never wanted me and only kept me out of legal obligation. That night, I cried harder than I had even at the funeral, mourning not just my father's death, but the death of any hope for family, belonging, or love in this house. Within days, the transformation from family member to servant would be complete, and my life would become something I never imagined possible in my darkest foster care nightmares. Have you ever experienced loss that changed everything in your life instantly? How do you cope when grief is compounded by additional trauma and rejection? Leave your thoughts below, because sharing these experiences helps all of us process difficult emotions and feel less isolated in our pain. The transformation from grieving stepmother to cruel taskmaster happened with shocking speed. Within a week of my father's funeral, my stepmother had completely restructured my role in the household. Gone was any pretense of treating me like a family member. I became domestic help, expected to handle the majority of household chores, while her biological children contributed minimally. My daily routine became exhausting and demeaning. I woke up earlier than everyone else to prepare breakfast for the family, not just simple meals but elaborate spreads that met everyone's specific preferences. After serving everyone, I would eat whatever remained, often standing at the counter rather than sitting at the table with others. Then I would clean up the entire kitchen before getting ready for school, frequently making me rushed and occasionally late. My stepmother showed no concern about my education or school performance, viewing school primarily as a break from household duties rather than an important priority. After school, more work awaited. I was responsible for cleaning the entire house, not just common areas, but including my stepmother's room and her children's rooms. I did all the laundry for the household, sorted, washed, folded, and put away everyone's clothes. I prepared dinner most evenings, following specific instructions about what each person wanted to eat. I washed all the dishes afterward, while the rest of the family relaxed, watching television or engaging in leisure activities I was never invited to join. Evening homework had to be completed late at night, after all chores were finished, usually leaving me exhausted and struggling to focus on assignments. Weekends offered no respite, but instead intensified the workload. Deep cleaning, yard work, grocery shopping, car washing, and any other tasks my stepmother decided needed completion. Her children would leave for social activities with friends, while I remained home working. When I expressed exhaustion or suggested the work distribution was unfair, my stepmother would remind me that I should be grateful for having shelter and food, that many adopted children end up in far worse situations, and that complaining demonstrated the kind of ungrateful attitude that made adopted children so difficult. She framed my servitude as character building, as teaching me work ethic and responsibility, as preparation for the real world, where nobody would give me anything for free. This gaslighting made me question my own perceptions and feelings. Maybe I was being ungrateful. Maybe this was normal, and my expectations were unreasonable. Maybe I deserved this treatment somehow. Beyond the physical labor, the emotional abuse was equally damaging. My stepmother criticized everything I did, finding fault with cleaning that wasn't thorough enough, meals that weren't tasty enough, and laundry that wasn't folded perfectly enough. Nothing I did met her standards, creating a constant state of anxiety and inadequacy. She compared me unfavorably to her biological children, pointing out how much easier, more pleasant, and more capable they were. She made comments about adopted children being inherently problematic, damaged by their early experiences, and unlikely to ever be truly normal or functional. These messages ate away at my self-esteem and sense of worth. My stepmother also isolated me socially. She discouraged friendships, claiming I didn't have time for social activities given my responsibilities. When school friends invited me to events, she usually denied permission, citing chores that needed completion. She never attended school functions or parent-teacher conferences, sending clear messages to teachers and administrators that I wasn't a priority. This isolation intensified my dependence on her and eliminated potential support systems that might have questioned or intervened in the situation. Financial control was another tool of domination. My father had left resources for my care, but my stepmother controlled everything. I received no allowance despite working constantly. I wore the same clothes repeatedly, while her children regularly received new items. School supplies, personal care products, and anything beyond absolute basics were provided grudgingly, if at all. She frequently reminded me how much I cost, how much of their resources I consumed, and how I should be grateful for every scrap I received. The sleeping arrangements changed as well. My room, which my father had helped me decorate and which represented my personal space, was reassigned to serve as storage and eventually given to one of my stepmother's children who wanted a larger space. I was moved to a small room in the basement, barely furnished with a bed and small dresser, cold in winter and hot in summer. This physical relegation to the least desirable space in the house symbolized my new status in the family hierarchy. My stepmother's children observed this treatment and never intervened or objected. They accepted the new dynamic, benefiting from my labor without apparent guilt or discomfort. They left their messes for me to clean, demanded specific meals without consideration for the work involved, and generally treated me as staff rather than family. Whether they were naturally cruel or simply following their mother's lead, the result was the same. I was isolated and unsupported even by peers in the household. The psychological impact of this transformation was devastating. I grieved my father constantly, while simultaneously enduring abuse and exploitation. I struggled with depression, experiencing frequent crying episodes, difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, and persistent hopelessness. My academic performance declined significantly as exhaustion and emotional turmoil made concentration impossible. Teachers noticed changes, but when they reached out to my stepmother expressing concern, she dismissed their observations, claiming I was simply struggling with grief and adjusting to our new family structure. I felt trapped in a nightmare with no escape route. The foster care system had taught me that instability was terrifying, and despite how awful my current situation was, the fear of being moved again, of losing even this terrible semblance of home, kept me from seeking help. My stepmother understood this fear and exploited it, occasionally threatening to disrupt the adoption or send me away whenever I showed any resistance. Looking back, I recognize this as classic abuse tactics: isolation, exploitation, degradation, and psychological manipulation designed to maintain control over someone vulnerable. But at the time, I lacked the knowledge, language, and support to identify what was happening or advocate for myself. I simply endured day after day, believing I had no other choice. Have you or someone you know experienced this kind of exploitation within family structures? What signs should people watch for to identify when children are being abused or mistreated? Please share your insights in the comments, because awareness and education are crucial for protecting vulnerable young people. The psychological damage from this period of my life extended far beyond the immediate exhaustion and sadness. Living in a state of constant stress, criticism, and emotional deprivation fundamentally changed how I viewed myself, relationships, and the world. The trauma of losing my father, combined with the abuse that followed, created complex emotional wounds that would take years to understand and begin healing. My self-esteem collapsed completely during this time. Every day brought messages that I was inadequate, burdensome, and unworthy of love or respect. When everything you do is criticized and nothing you accomplish is acknowledged, you begin to internalize the narrative that you are fundamentally flawed. I started believing that maybe my stepmother was right, that maybe I was damaged, difficult, and deserving of this treatment. This internalized shame became part of my identity, affecting how I interacted with everyone. At school, I became withdrawn and quiet, avoiding social interactions because I felt I had nothing of value to offer. When teachers praised my work, I dismissed their compliments, assuming they were just being polite. When classmates invited me to join activities, I declined, believing they couldn't actually want my company. This self-imposed isolation reinforced the loneliness I already experienced at home. Trust became impossible for me. My father had taught me to trust, to believe in the goodness of people and the possibility of genuine love. His death and my stepmother's betrayal shattered that foundation completely. If someone who claimed to be family could treat me so cruelly, how could I ever trust anyone again? This lack of trust extended to authority figures who should have been protective. Teachers, counselors, even police officers seemed like potential threats rather than sources of help. I convinced myself that revealing my situation would only make things worse, that adults wouldn't believe me or wouldn't care enough to intervene effectively. Depression settled over me like a heavy blanket, making everything feel pointless and exhausting. I experienced all the classic symptoms: persistent sadness, loss of interest in activities I once enjoyed, changes in sleep patterns and appetite, difficulty concentrating, and frequent thoughts about death. Some mornings I could barely force myself out of bed. Knowing another day of criticism, labor, and loneliness awaited, I went through motions mechanically, feeling disconnected from my own life, as if watching everything happen to someone else. The emotional numbness that developed as a coping mechanism concerned me even more than the sadness. At least sadness was feeling something, confirming I was still human and alive. But increasingly, I felt nothing, just emptiness and exhaustion. I stopped crying eventually, not because things improved, but because I had no tears left. This emotional shutdown worried me on some level, a distant recognition that something was seriously wrong, but I lacked the energy or hope to address it. Academic decline became another source of stress and shame. I had always been a good student, partly because it pleased my father, and partly because education represented potential escape from difficult circumstances. But maintaining grades while exhausted, depressed, and working constantly became impossible. My homework was rushed and incomplete. I fell asleep during classes. I stopped participating in discussions or asking questions. Tests that I once would have aced became struggles just to finish. Teachers expressed concern and disappointment, adding another layer of failure to my already overwhelming sense of inadequacy. I became hyper-vigilant, constantly monitoring my stepmother's moods and reactions, trying to anticipate what might trigger criticism or anger. This state of perpetual alertness is exhausting and prevents any sense of relaxation or safety. I would replay conversations and interactions obsessively, analyzing what I might have done wrong and how I could avoid similar mistakes. This anxiety made it difficult to sleep, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios and perceived failures even when physically exhausted. Flashbacks to happier times with my father became both comfort and torture. I would remember our Saturday breakfasts, evening walks, and conversations, reliving those moments of genuine love and acceptance. But these memories intensified the grief, highlighting everything I had lost and would never experience again. Sometimes the pain of remembering felt unbearable, and I tried to suppress memories entirely, afraid that holding on to them would prevent me from surviving my current reality. I developed unhealthy coping mechanisms, not substance abuse, which I had no access to, but other forms of escape and self-harm. I would spend hours daydreaming elaborate fantasies where my father was still alive or where I was rescued by some miraculous intervention. These fantasies became so consuming that reality felt even more unbearable by comparison. I also engaged in subtle forms of self-punishment, believing on some level that I deserved the mistreatment, that I was bad and needed correction. My sense of identity became confused and fragmented. I didn't know who I was anymore beyond the role of servant and burden. All the interests, dreams, and personality traits my father had encouraged and celebrated felt distant and irrelevant. I defined myself entirely by my utility and compliance, measuring my worth only by whether I successfully completed tasks and avoided criticism. This loss of self is one of the most insidious effects of sustained abuse, the erasure of personhood until you exist only in relation to others' demands and expectations. Social connections became nearly impossible to maintain. The few friendships I had established before my father's death gradually dissolved as I withdrew and became unavailable. Friends stopped inviting me to activities after repeated rejections. They didn't understand what was happening in my home life because I couldn't explain it, partly from shame and partly from fear of consequences if my stepmother discovered I was talking about our family situation. This social isolation meant I had nobody to provide reality checks, emotional support, or alternative perspectives on my situation. Physical symptoms emerged from the chronic stress. I experienced frequent headaches, stomach problems, muscle tension, and general fatigue that went beyond what sleep deprivation alone could explain. My body was manifesting the emotional and psychological trauma, breaking down under the sustained pressure. I ignored these symptoms, having no time or permission to address health concerns unless they became absolutely debilitating. The concept of hope became foreign to me. I couldn't envision any future different from my present circumstances. This hopelessness is dangerous because it eliminates motivation to seek change or help. If you believe nothing will ever improve, why bother trying? Why risk making things worse by attempting to alter the situation? This learned helplessness kept me trapped as effectively as any locked door. Understanding the psychological impact of sustained emotional abuse and exploitation is crucial for recognizing these situations and intervening appropriately. Many people suffer silently because the abuse leaves no visible marks, and because victims themselves often don't recognize what's happening as abuse. Have you experienced or witnessed the long-term psychological effects of emotional abuse? What helped in beginning the healing process? Share your thoughts below because these conversations help break the silence and shame surrounding abuse. Despite my depression and hopelessness, some part of me still wanted things to improve, still believed maybe somehow the situation could change. Over the months following my father's death, I made several attempts to advocate for myself or seek help, each meeting different obstacles and ultimately failing to produce meaningful change. But these attempts were important because they represented resistance, refusal to completely accept the narrative that I deserved this treatment. My first attempt involved talking directly with my stepmother, explaining how exhausted and overwhelmed I felt, asking if we could redistribute chores more fairly. I approached this conversation carefully, trying to be respectful and reasonable, avoiding anything that might be interpreted as attacking or ungrateful. I emphasized that I wanted to contribute to the household, but needed some balance to succeed in school and maintain my health. Her response was immediate and harsh. She accused me of being lazy, entitled and disrespectful. She reminded me that she didn't have to keep me at all, that I should be thankful for what I had, rather than complaining about doing basic chores. She suggested that perhaps I needed counseling to deal with my bad attitude and adjustment problems. This reaction taught me that direct communication with her was pointless and potentially dangerous, likely to result in more restrictions or punishments rather than any accommodation. Next, I tried reaching out to my school counselor, a kind woman who had noticed my declining grades and increasing withdrawal. During a meeting about my academic performance, I hinted at difficulties at home, mentioning that I had a lot of responsibilities and was struggling to balance everything. The counselor seemed concerned and asked if I wanted to talk more specifically about my home situation, but fear paralyzed me in that moment. What if the counselor called my stepmother? What if authorities got involved and I ended up back in foster care? What if speaking up made everything worse? I backed down, claiming everything was fine, just normal grief and adjustment after losing my father. The counselor didn't push, probably not wanting to pressure a grieving student, and the opportunity passed. I contacted an uncle from my father's side of the family, someone who had been kind to me before my father's death. I sent him an email explaining generally that things were difficult at home and asking if we could stay in touch or maybe visit sometimes. His response was sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful. He expressed condolences for my loss and encouraged me to be patient with my stepmother, who was also grieving and adjusting to widowhood. He suggested that I should try to be helpful and understanding during this difficult time for everyone. He didn't offer any concrete support or seem to recognize that I was asking for help. This response reinforced my sense that adults, either wouldn't understand or wouldn't intervene even if they did. I researched my legal rights, spending time in the school library looking up information about adoption, guardianship, and child welfare laws. I learned that legally, my stepmother was my parent with full authority over me unless clear evidence of abuse or neglect could be proven. What I was experiencing, the excessive chores and emotional coldness, existed in a grey area that might not meet legal thresholds for intervention. I learned about emancipation, but discovered I was too young and lacked the financial resources to qualify. This research was both empowering and discouraging, giving me information but highlighting how few options I actually had. I attempted to document what was happening, keeping a journal where I recorded daily chores, hours spent working, instances of verbal abuse, and my emotional state. I thought maybe having concrete documentation would be useful if I ever did report the situation officially. But keeping this journal also forced me to confront the full extent of what I was enduring. Reading my own accounts of daily degradation was depressing and made me feel even more hopeless. Eventually, I stopped maintaining the journal because it felt pointless and only intensified my suffering. At one point, I contacted Child Protective Services anonymously from a payphone, describing a hypothetical situation very similar to my own and asking what would happen if a report was made. The worker explained that they would investigate, interview family members, and assess the situation. But they also explained that removing children from homes only happened in extreme cases of abuse or neglect, and that their goal was typically to provide support and services to keep families together. This information terrified me. An investigation would alert my stepmother that someone had reported concerns. If I wasn't removed, which seemed likely given that I had shelter, food, and no visible injuries, I would face her anger and retaliation. The risk seemed too great for uncertain benefit. I tried being perfect, thinking maybe if I did everything exactly right without any complaints, my stepmother would soften and treat me better. I worked harder, accepted all criticism without response, tried to be invisible and convenient, but this strategy failed completely. No amount of compliance or perfection changed her fundamental attitude toward me. If anything, my increased submission seemed to invite more exploitation and contempt. She simply increased expectations and workload, taking advantage of my willingness to accept anything without protest. I entertained fantasies of running away, imagining leaving in the middle of the night and somehow making it on my own. But practical reality quickly dispelled these fantasies. Where would I go? How would I survive? As a minor with no money and no support system, running away would likely lead to homelessness, exploitation, or return to foster care. The streets were dangerous, and I had no skills or resources for independent survival. Running away would likely make my situation worse rather than better. Each failed attempt to improve my situation deepened my sense of helplessness and resignation. I began to believe that this was simply my life now, that I had to endure until I turned 18 and could legally leave. 4 years felt like an eternity when each day was already unbearable, but it was the only hope I had. Survival became my only goal, getting through each day without breaking down completely, maintaining enough functionality to avoid drawing attention that might make things worse. This survival mode is exhausting and dehumanizing, reducing existence to mere endurance rather than any quality of life. The attempts themselves were important, though, even in failure. They demonstrated that I hadn't completely given up, that some part of me still believed I deserved better treatment, that my situation was wrong even if I couldn't change it. These attempts represented resistance against the narrative that I was worthless and deserving of abuse. They kept alive a small spark of dignity and self-advocacy that would eventually, years later, become the foundation for genuine healing and recovery. Have you ever felt trapped in a situation where every attempt to create change seemed to fail? How did you maintain hope or find the strength to keep trying? Share your experience in the comments, because others in similar situations need to know they're not alone. And that persistence matters even when immediate results aren't visible. Years have passed since those dark days living under my stepmother's control, and the distance of time has allowed me to reflect on what that experience taught me and how I eventually found the strength to survive and eventually thrive. The lessons were brutal, learned through pain and suffering, but they shaped who I am today in both positive and challenging ways. Understanding these lessons has been crucial to my healing process. First and most importantly, I learned that family is defined by love and choice, not by blood or legal documents. My father showed me this truth when he chose to adopt me and loved me unconditionally. My stepmother demonstrated the opposite, that legal family status means nothing without genuine care and commitment. This lesson was painful but valuable, teaching me to seek and build relationships based on authentic connection rather than obligation or expectation. The family I've created for myself as an adult, my chosen family of friends and partners who truly care for me, is more real and meaningful than many biological families. I learned resilience I didn't know I possessed, surviving years of exploitation and emotional abuse while maintaining enough functionality to eventually escape required strength I never imagined having. Every morning I got up and faced another day of that existence was an act of survival and resistance. This resilience has served me well in facing other challenges throughout life. I know now that I can endure difficult circumstances, that I'm stronger than my worst moments, and that suffering, while terrible, doesn't have to destroy me permanently. I learned the signs of abuse and manipulation, knowledge that has helped me recognize and avoid toxic relationships in adulthood. I can now identify gaslighting when someone tries to make me question my own perceptions and feelings. I recognize exploitation when someone takes advantage of my kindness or willingness to help. I understand boundary violations and the importance of maintaining healthy limits in relationships. This awareness, paid for so dearly during my youth, has protected me countless times since then from people who might have harmed me if I hadn't learned these lessons. I learned that my worth is inherent, not dependent on what I can do for others or whether I meet someone else's standards and expectations. This lesson took longest to internalize because my stepmother spent years teaching me the opposite, that my value came solely from my utility and compliance. Unlearning that destructive message and recognizing that I have worth simply by existing, that I deserve respect and kindness regardless of my productivity or perfection, has been transformative. I still struggle with this sometimes, catching myself seeking validation through achievement or helpfulness, but I recognize the pattern now and can challenge it. I learned that asking for help is strength, not weakness, although it took me far too long to learn this lesson. For years during and after my time with my stepmother, I tried to handle everything alone, believing that needing help proved I was inadequate. Eventually I realized that humans are interconnected, that we're meant to support each other, and that accepting help doesn't diminish me, but rather demonstrates wisdom and self-awareness. Therapy, support groups, and honest, vulnerable conversations with trusted people have been essential to my healing, none of which would have been possible if I hadn't learned to ask for and accept help. I learned that grief is complex and long-lasting, especially when complicated by other trauma. Losing my father remains one of the most painful experiences of my life, and that grief didn't simply disappear with time. It transformed, became something I carry with me rather than something that actively destroys me daily, but it never completely goes away. Learning to hold space for grief while still building a meaningful life has been an ongoing process. I've learned that I can be sad about what I lost while simultaneously grateful for what I have now, that these emotions can coexist without canceling each other out. I learned about systemic failures that allow children to fall through cracks and suffer abuse undetected. My situation was not unique. Thousands of children experience exploitation, abuse, and neglect within families, while systems designed to protect them fail to intervene effectively. Understanding these systemic issues has motivated me to advocate for better protections, more resources for vulnerable children, and increased awareness about the realities of adoption and foster care. My suffering has purpose if it can contribute to preventing similar suffering for others. I learned forgiveness is complicated and not always necessary for healing. Many people suggested I needed to forgive my stepmother to move on and find peace. But I've come to understand that forgiveness is personal and complex, that I don't owe forgiveness to someone who harmed me deeply and never acknowledged or apologized for that harm. I can heal, move forward, and build a good life without forgiving her. What matters is releasing the hold that anger and resentment have on me, not excusing her behavior or pretending it was acceptable. I learned that survival sometimes requires compromises and choices that might not make sense to others. I stayed in that situation longer than some people think I should have, because leaving felt more dangerous and uncertain than staying. That choice, made from a place of fear and limited options, doesn't mean I was weak or complicit in my own mistreatment. It means I did what I believed necessary to survive with the information and resources I had available. I refused to shame my younger self for those choices. I learned that recovery is not linear. with progress, setbacks, breakthroughs, and struggles all part of the process. Some days I feel strong and healed, confident in who I've become. Other days, old wounds feel raw and tender, triggered by something unexpected. Both experiences are valid parts of the healing journey. I've learned to be patient with myself, to recognize that healing from complex trauma takes time, and that setbacks don't erase progress. Most importantly, I learned that my past does not define my future. What happened to me was terrible and unfair, leaving scars that will always be part of me. But those experiences and scars don't limit what I can become or accomplish. I am not just a victim of abuse, an orphaned adopted child, or a survivor of trauma. I am a complete person with dreams, talents, relationships, and potential. My story includes dark chapters, but it doesn't end there. I'm writing new chapters now, filled with healing, growth, connection, and hope. What lessons have you learned from difficult experiences? How have challenges shaped who you are today? Share your reflections in the comments, because our stories of resilience and growth inspire others who are still struggling to see the possibility of healing and better days ahead. If you're watching this video and seeing your own experience reflected in my story, I want you to know several crucial things. First, what is happening to you is not okay, and it's not your fault. Abuse and exploitation within families is never the victim's fault, regardless of what the abuser claims. You deserve love, respect, dignity, and care. Your worth is inherent and not dependent on your usefulness, compliance, or perfection. Second, you are not alone, even though it feels that way. Thousands of adopted children and young people in foster care face similar situations, suffering exploitation and abuse within systems and families that should protect them. The isolation that abuse creates is powerful, making victims believe their situation is unique and that nobody would understand or care. But this isolation is a lie. There are people who understand, who care, and who want to help. Reaching out is terrifying, especially when previous attempts have failed or when the potential consequences seem overwhelming. But staying silent guarantees nothing changes. Third, survival is an accomplishment. If you are enduring an abusive situation right now, every day you get through is a victory. You are stronger than you realize, more resilient than you know. The coping mechanisms you've developed, the ways you've learned to protect yourself emotionally and psychologically, these are signs of strength, not weakness. Don't shame yourself for doing what you need to do to survive. When you're ready, when you have resources and support, you can move from survival mode to healing and thriving. But surviving now, getting through each day, is enough. Fourth, there are resources and people who can help even if your previous attempts to seek help didn't work out. Keep trying. Talk to teachers, counselors, coaches, friends, parents, or other adults who seem trustworthy. Contact Child Protective Services or organizations specifically dedicated to helping youth in difficult situations. Call helplines designed to support young people experiencing abuse. Not every adult will respond appropriately, but some will. Keep reaching out until you find someone who listens and takes action. Document what's happening when possible. Keep records of abuse, exploitation, or neglect. This documentation can be crucial if authorities do get involved. Fifth, your education matters and can be your path to eventual independence. Despite exhaustion and depression, try to maintain your academic performance as much as possible. Education is power and opportunity. It opens doors that can lead away from abusive situations. Schools also have resources like counselors, social workers, and teachers who are mandated reporters of abuse. Even if you're scared to speak up directly, performing poorly in school or showing signs of distress may prompt adults to ask questions and potentially intervene. Sixth, hold on to hope even when it seems impossible. Your current situation is temporary, even though it feels permanent and endless. You will eventually age out of childhood, gain legal independence, and have the power to leave and build the life you choose. That future might feel impossibly far away, but it will come. Surviving until then is the goal. Once you reach independence, you can begin the healing process, build healthy relationships, and create the family and life you deserve. Many people who endured terrible childhoods go on to build beautiful adult lives. Your past does not determine your future. Seventh, consider that healing is possible and worthwhile. The damage from abuse runs deep, affecting how you see yourself, others, and the world. Professional help through therapy or counseling can be transformative in unpacking trauma, developing healthy coping mechanisms, and building self-worth. Healing takes time and effort, but it's possible. You can move from merely surviving to actually thriving, from feeling broken to feeling whole. The wounds may leave scars, but scars are evidence of survival and healing, not ongoing damage. For those watching who haven't personally experienced this but know someone who might be, I urge you to pay attention and be willing to help. Notice the signs: children who are exhausted, withdrawn, anxious, performing poorly in school, lacking appropriate clothing or care, or showing other indicators of distress. If a young person hints at problems at home, take them seriously. Create safe opportunities for them to talk. Report concerns to appropriate authorities. Your attention and action could save someone from years of suffering. To my stepmother, if you ever see this, I want you to know the impact of your choices. Your cruelty toward a grieving child was unconscionable. The years I spent under your control left damage that took years to begin healing. I don't know if you ever felt guilt or regret for how you treated me, but you should. You had the opportunity to show compassion to a child who had lost everything, and instead you chose exploitation and abuse. Whatever justifications you told yourself, whatever rationalizations you used, they don't excuse what you did. And finally, to my father, I know you can't hear this, but I need to say it anyway. Thank you for choosing me, for loving me, for showing me what family should look like. Those 3 years with you were the happiest of my childhood. I carry the lessons you taught me, the love you showed me every single day. Your death was devastating, and what came after was terrible, but nothing can take away what you gave me. The knowledge that I was worthy of love, that I mattered, that I was someone's chosen son. That foundation, as shattered as it became, eventually helped me rebuild myself. I wish you could see who I've become. I think you'd be proud. My story doesn't have a fairy tale ending where everything becomes perfect and all wounds magically heal. Real life is more complicated than that. But it does have hope, resilience, survival, growth, and the ongoing work of healing and building a meaningful life. If my story resonates with you, if you've experienced something similar, or if you're currently in an abusive situation, please leave a comment. Share your story if you feel safe doing so. Let's break the silence surrounding family abuse and create community and support for those who are suffering. And if you found value in this video, if you think this message needs to be heard by others, please share it widely. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, share this video with anyone who might need to hear it. Together we can raise awareness, support survivors, and work toward protecting vulnerable children from exploitation and abuse. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of this conversation. Remember, you matter, your story matters, and you deserve love, respect, and dignity. Never give up hope that better days are possible, because they are. Stay strong, reach out for help when you can, and know that you are not alone.